What did you find in your teacher's desk that changed everything you thought you knew? I was looking for a stapler when I found the photographs. Mrs. Calloway had sent me back to her classroom during lunch to grab supplies for the afternoon presentation, and her desk drawer stuck when I pulled it. Inside were dozens of Polaroids of students, all taken from odd angles through windows and doorways. My face was in 7 of them. I was reaching for my phone to text my best friend Aisha when I noticed the dates written on the backs. Some went back 5 years, long before I'd even started at Lincoln High. The handwriting was neat and precise, with little notes beneath each date. Promising candidate, under a photo of Derek Liu from my chemistry class. Responds well to authority, under one of Aisha leaving the gym. Requires more observation, under 3 separate shots of me walking to my car. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the entire stack. I pulled out my phone and started photographing every single Polaroid, making sure the dates and notes were visible. There had to be at least 60 photos spread across 4 different stacks, organized by some system I couldn't quite figure out. Mrs. Calloway was the school's college counselor, and everyone trusted her completely. She'd helped my older brother get into Princeton 2 years ago, and my parents literally worshipped her. Last month, she'd sat me down for 3 hours going over my application essays and telling me exactly how to present myself to admissions committees. She knew everything about my family, my goals, my insecurities. The photo of me crying in my car after failing my physics midterm had a note that said, "Vulnerable period. Approach carefully." The classroom door opened, and I shoved the photos back into the drawer so fast that some of them scattered onto the floor. Mrs. Calloway stood in the doorway holding a sandwich, her expression shifting from surprise to something I couldn't quite identify. "I thought you'd be gone by now," she said quietly, and I noticed her eyes were already on the photos at my feet. I bent down to pick them up, my mind racing through possible explanations, but there was no innocent reason for a teacher to have surveillance photos of students with predatory notes. She took 3 steps into the room and locked the door behind her. "We should talk about what you just found," she said, and her voice had changed completely from the warm, maternal tone she always used. This voice was cold and businesslike, the voice of someone used to managing problems. "Why do you have photos of me?" I asked, and I was proud that my voice only shook a little. She set her sandwich down on a student desk and held out her hand for the Polaroids I'd picked up. When I didn't move, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I help students reach their full potential, Jasmine. Sometimes that requires understanding them better than they understand themselves. Your brother benefited from my guidance, didn't he?" The way she said guidance made my skin crawl. I thought about Cameron suddenly changing his entire personality senior year, becoming this focused, intense version of himself that our parents loved, but that always seemed slightly wrong. He'd stopped hanging out with his friends, spent every afternoon in Mrs. Calloway's office, and started talking about success and legacy and making our family proud in this weird, robotic way. "You're manipulating students," I said, and she actually laughed. "I'm optimizing outcomes. Do you know how many of my students get into Ivy League schools? 43% over the last 5 years compared to the state average of 2%. I identify promising candidates early and provide intensive, personalized guidance. Your parents paid me $8,000 to help Cameron. They've already given me $6,000 for you." The room felt smaller suddenly. My parents had never mentioned paying Mrs. Calloway anything. They'd told me she was donating her time because she believed in our family. "That's illegal," I said, and she shook her head slowly. "Private educational consulting is perfectly legal. The fact that I also work at the school is irrelevant. I'm providing a service that parents are desperate for in this economy." I pulled out my phone and she moved faster than I expected, crossing the distance between us and grabbing my wrist hard enough to hurt. "Don't make this complicated, Jasmine. You're a smart girl. Think about what happens if you try to expose this. Your brother's Princeton acceptance was based on recommendation letters I wrote. If I withdraw those letters and explain that they were based on fabricated achievements, he gets expelled. Your father just took out a second mortgage to pay his tuition. Your mother quit her job to support his education. One email from me destroys all of that." She was still holding my wrist, her fingers pressed against my pulse point. I could feel my heartbeat hammering against her thumb. "Let go of me," I said, and after a long moment, she did. "Here's what's going to happen," Mrs. Calloway said, walking back to her desk and sitting down behind it in her normal spot. "You're going to delete whatever photos you took. Then you're going to forget you saw anything, and we're going to continue working on your applications exactly as planned. In exchange, I'll make sure you get into Stanford, which is your dream school. I'll write recommendation letters that guarantee admission. You'll have the future you've always wanted, and your family stays intact. Everyone wins." She folded her hands on the desk and smiled at me with that warm, maternal expression she usually wore. I wanted to throw up. "What if I say no?" I asked, and her smile disappeared. "Then I'll tell your parents that you tried to blackmail me by threatening to make false accusations unless I helped you cheat on your SATs. I have documentation prepared. Your college prospects evaporate, your family's reputation is destroyed, and Cameron still loses everything." I left the classroom without the stapler, walking on legs that felt disconnected from my body. The hallway was empty during lunch period except for Vice Principal Okonkwo doing his usual rounds. He nodded at me and I nodded back, wondering if he had any idea what was happening in his school. Probably not. Mrs. Calloway had been here for 12 years and everyone treated her with reverence. Parents called her a miracle worker. The local newspaper had done a profile on her last year titled The College Whisperer. I'd read that article 3 times when it came out, feeling so grateful that she'd chosen to help me. The cognitive dissonance of knowing someone was a predator while everyone else saw them as a saint was making my head pound. Aisha found me in the bathroom, sitting on the floor with my head between my knees. "You look terrible," she said, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, her expression getting darker with every detail. When I finished, she pulled out her phone. "We're calling the police right now," but I grabbed her hand before she could dial. "She'll destroy my family, Aisha. My parents took out loans for Cameron's school. My dad's been working 70-hour weeks. If Cameron gets expelled, they lose everything they've sacrificed for." Aisha sat down next to me on the gross bathroom floor. "So what are you going to do? Just let her keep manipulating you?" I didn't have an answer. The bell rang for 5th period, and we both stayed sitting there while students flooded the hallways outside. That night, I went through my brother's room while he was at his study group. I found a folder hidden in his closet labeled Guidance Materials, with printouts of emails between Cameron and Mrs. Calloway going back 3 years. She'd coached him on every single aspect of his personality, from what books to mention in conversations, to what opinions to express in class. "Remember to disagree with Professor Walsh about Keynesian economics. It shows independent thinking," one email read. Another said, "Your essay about your grandmother's immigration is too honest. You sound bitter. Revise to show gratitude and resilience." There were dozens of these, creating a completely fabricated version of my brother that existed only to impress admissions committees. The real Cameron had loved skateboarding and graphic novels and wanted to study art. The new Cameron majored in economics and talked about investment banking. I photographed every page, then put the folder back exactly where I'd found it. My phone was full of evidence now, but I didn't know what to do with it. If I went to the school administration, Mrs. Calloway would follow through on her threats before any investigation could start. If I went to the police, they'd say it was a civil matter since she technically wasn't breaking any laws by offering private consulting. The surveillance photos were creepy but not necessarily illegal. The manipulation was horrifying but hard to prove. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about how she'd grabbed my wrist, how casual she'd been about destroying my family. I'd spent months trusting her completely, telling her my deepest insecurities and fears, and she'd been filing all of it away to use as leverage. The next morning, I walked into school with a plan. I went straight to the library and asked Mrs. Kowalski, the librarian, if I could look at old yearbooks. She pointed me toward the archive section, and I pulled out yearbooks from the last 12 years, starting from when Mrs. Calloway first arrived. I made a list of every student she'd helped get into prestigious universities, then cross-referenced them with the current student directory to find which ones had younger siblings still at the school. 43 students had gotten into Ivy League schools under her guidance. 21 of them had siblings currently enrolled. I started with the seniors who'd be most invested in protecting their own college chances. Marcus Webb's sister had gotten into Yale 4 years ago, and he was in my AP literature class. I caught him after school and asked if we could talk privately. We walked to the empty auditorium, and I showed him the photos on my phone, both the surveillance pictures and the emails from Cameron's folder. His face went completely white. "She has photos of me too," he said quietly. "I found them last year when I was helping her file paperwork. She told me the same thing she told you, that she'd destroy my sister's degree and my family's finances if I told anyone. So I didn't." His hands were shaking. "My sister's different now. She comes home for holidays and she's like a stranger. She talks about networking and personal branding and optimizing her trajectory. She used to want to be a poet." We spent the next week quietly recruiting. Every student we approached had the same story. They'd found something suspicious. Mrs. Calloway had threatened their families, and they'd stayed silent to protect their siblings or parents. By Friday, we had 11 students ready to come forward together. Safety in numbers meant she couldn't threaten all of us effectively, but we needed more than testimony. We needed evidence that couldn't be denied. That's when Marcus remembered something. "She keeps everything," he said during our meeting in Aisha's basement. "When I was helping her file, I saw boxes in her storage closet labeled by year. If she's been doing this for 12 years, there's probably documentation going back to the beginning." Breaking into the school was easier than it should have been. The security guard, Mr. Reynolds, went on his break at 9:30 every night and spent exactly 20 minutes in his car watching videos on his phone. Marcus had timed it 3 times to be sure. We went in through the loading dock door that didn't latch properly, something every student knew about, but administrators apparently didn't. The hallways were dark and strange without students filling them. Our phones provided just enough light to navigate to Mrs. Calloway's office. The door was locked, but Aisha's older sister had taught her to pick basic locks using bobby pins. It took 7 minutes of fumbling before we heard the click. The office looked different at night, less welcoming and more predatory. Mrs. Calloway's desk was covered with framed photos of smiling students holding acceptance letters. I recognized most of them. They all had that same slightly vacant look in their eyes that Cameron had, the look of people performing a version of themselves they'd been coached to become. The storage closet was behind a bookshelf, and when we opened it, we found exactly what Marcus had described. Boxes stacked floor to ceiling, each one labeled with a year and a category. Surveillance photos 2018 to 2019 read one. Email archives 2020 to 2021 read another. Financial records read a third. We started pulling out boxes and photographing everything we could. The financial records were the jackpot. Mrs. Calloway had kept meticulous accounting of every dollar she'd received from every family, along with contracts that parents had signed agreeing to pay for premium educational consulting services. The contracts had clauses about confidentiality and non-disclosure. She'd collected over $600,000 in the last 5 years alone. The surveillance photos went back to her first year at Lincoln High, starting with just a few students and expanding each year as she perfected her system. The emails showed the full extent of her manipulation, coaching students on everything from their body language to their political opinions to which extracurriculars would photograph best on social media. We were so focused on documenting everything that we didn't hear the door open. Mrs. Calloway stood in the doorway, and she wasn't alone. Principal Brennan was with her, looking grim. I called him the moment the motion sensors detected movement in my office, Mrs. Calloway said calmly. I'm disappointed, Jasmine. I thought we had an understanding. Principal Brennan looked at the boxes we'd pulled out, at the photos scattered across the floor, at our phones full of evidence. This is breaking and entering, he said. I'm calling the police and your parents. But Mrs. Calloway held up a hand. Let's not be hasty, Richard. These students made a mistake. We can handle this internally if they agree to return everything they've taken and sign statements admitting to burglary. Are you serious? Aisha said, and her voice was shaking with rage. You've been stalking and manipulating students for years, stealing money from families, and you want to charge us with burglary? Principal Brennan looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Calloway, what exactly is in these boxes? She smiled that warm, maternal smile. Private consulting materials for my independent business. The students are upset because I can't help all of them and they're trying to sabotage my reputation. You know how college admissions stress affects teenagers. They become irrational. Brennan was nodding along, already half convinced. He'd worked with Mrs. Calloway for 12 years. He'd seen her transform the school's college acceptance rates. He wanted to believe her. Call the parents of every student she's helped, Marcus said desperately. Ask them if they paid her. Ask them if they signed contracts. This isn't about consulting. It's about her manipulating vulnerable families and preying on students. Mrs. Calloway's expression finally cracked, just for a second. You have no idea what you're trying to destroy, she said, and her voice had that cold, businesslike tone again. I have transformed lives. Students who would have gone to community college are at Harvard. Families who would have stayed trapped in poverty have moved into the middle class. You think you're exposing corruption, but you're just jealous children who want to tear down someone who's accomplished more than you ever will. Principal Brennan's phone rang. He looked at the caller ID and frowned. It's Superintendent Davis. She never calls this late. He answered it, and we watched his expression change as he listened. Yes, they're here now. How did you know? He listened some more, his face going pale. I understand. Yes, I'll secure everything. He hung up and looked at Mrs. Calloway with something close to horror. The superintendent received an anonymous email 20 minutes ago containing financial records and surveillance photos. The school board has been called into emergency session. She's on her way here now with the district's legal counsel. I looked at my phone. None of us had sent anything yet. We'd been planning to organize all the evidence first before going public. Mrs. Calloway was already on her phone, frantically typing. Who sent it? She demanded. Which one of you had copies already? None of us answered because we genuinely didn't know. The office door opened again, and my brother Cameron walked in, holding his laptop. I sent it, he said quietly. Jasmine came home with photos of your emails to me. I went through my own records and found everything you'd made me do over the last 3 years. I sent the whole archive to the superintendent, the school board, and the state education department. Mrs. Calloway's phone slipped from her hand and clattered on the floor. You graduated already, Cameron. This doesn't affect you anymore. Why would you destroy yourself? Cameron looked at her with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Because I looked in the mirror last week and didn't recognize myself. Because I'm majoring in something I hate to impress people I don't respect. Because my sister was about to go through the same thing I did, and I couldn't let that happen. He turned to Principal Brennan. I'll withdraw from Princeton tonight and return any scholarship money. I'll testify to whatever investigators need. But my sister and these other students shouldn't have to break into offices to expose what's happening. You should have been protecting us. Superintendent Davis arrived with 2 lawyers and a police detective who specialized in crimes involving minors. They spent 4 hours going through every box in Mrs. Calloway's office while we sat in the principal's conference room giving statements. My parents showed up at midnight, looking confused and terrified. My mom kept crying and asking what we'd done wrong, why we'd broken into the school. Cameron sat her down and showed her the emails, the contracts she'd signed, the surveillance photos of me. She went very quiet, and then she looked at Mrs. Calloway through the conference room window with an expression of absolute fury. We trusted you with our children, she said, and her voice was shaking. We paid you everything we had. The investigation moved faster than I expected. The state education department suspended Mrs. Calloway's credentials within 48 hours pending a full review. The district hired a forensic accountant to go through her financial records and found she'd collected over $900,000 from families over 12 years, none of which had been reported as income. The surveillance photos triggered a criminal investigation into stalking and invasion of privacy. Parents started filing civil lawsuits. The local newspaper that had praised her as the college whisperer published a new article titled "Predator in Plain Sight." Everything unraveled in less than a week, 12 years of carefully constructed manipulation collapsing under the weight of evidence. Cameron withdrew from Princeton and enrolled at community college to study graphic design. My parents tried to talk him out of it, but he was immovable. "I'm not going to keep living someone else's idea of success," he told them at dinner one night. "I'm 20 years old and I have no idea who I actually am. I need to figure that out before I make any more decisions about my future." My mom cried, but eventually she nodded. My dad looked defeated for weeks, mourning the Princeton dream more than Cameron ever did. But slowly, I watched my brother come back to himself. He started sketching again, laughing more, talking about things he actually cared about instead of optimizing his personal brand. The criminal charges took longer to process. Mrs. Calloway was arrested 6 weeks after we broke into her office, charged with stalking, unlawful surveillance, tax evasion, and fraud. Her lawyer tried to argue that she'd provided legitimate consulting services, but the surveillance photos and manipulative emails destroyed that defense. The trial lasted 3 weeks. 47 former students testified about her methods, describing the same pattern of manipulation and threats. Parents testified about paying thousands of dollars they couldn't afford because Mrs. Calloway convinced them it was the only way their children would succeed. The prosecutor displayed the surveillance photos on a massive screen, showing years of predatory behavior documented in Polaroid. I testified on day 9. The defense attorney tried to make me look vindictive, asking why I'd broken into her office instead of going through proper channels. "Because she threatened to destroy my family if I reported her," I said clearly. She'd been doing this for 12 years without anyone stopping her. Going through proper channels meant giving her time to cover her tracks and hurt the people I loved. The attorney pressed harder, suggesting I was jealous of her success. I looked directly at Mrs. Calloway, who was sitting at the defense table looking smaller than I remembered. "I'm not jealous of someone who turned helping students into a predatory business. I'm angry that she was allowed to do it for so long." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Mrs. Calloway showed no emotion when the verdict was read, just stared straight ahead at the wall behind the judge. Sentencing happened 2 weeks later. 5 years in prison, 3 years probation, permanent revocation of teaching credentials, and restitution to all affected families. The judge called her actions a betrayal of the highest order. "You held a position of trust and authority over vulnerable young people," the judge said. "You exploited their ambitions and their families' desperation for your own financial gain. You damaged countless lives in pursuit of profit and ego. The harm you've caused will echo for years." Mrs. Calloway was led away in handcuffs, and I felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, just exhausted relief that it was over. Lincoln High hired a new college counselor named Dr. Patel, who spent her first month meeting individually with every student Mrs. Calloway had worked with, trying to undo the damage. She was patient and kind, encouraging us to figure out what we actually wanted instead of what would look impressive to strangers. I spent hours in her office talking about my real interests, my actual strengths, my genuine dreams. Slowly, I started to separate my authentic self from the performed version Mrs. Calloway had been coaching me to become. It was harder than I expected. After months of manipulation, I'd internalized her voice, second-guessing every choice and wondering if I was being strategic enough. Aisha got into Northwestern for journalism and wrote her admission essay about exposing Mrs. Calloway's operation. Marcus chose not to apply to Ivy League schools at all, enrolling at a state university close to home where he could study environmental science. I applied to Stanford but also to 6 other schools I'd never considered before, places that fit who I actually was instead of who I'd been coached to become. When my acceptance letter arrived from UC Berkeley's art program, I cried for an hour. It wasn't the school I'd been planning on, but it was perfect for what I actually wanted to study. My parents hung the acceptance letter on the refrigerator next to Cameron's community college enrollment confirmation. Both of us starting over, both of us finally honest. The civil lawsuits against Mrs. Calloway and the school district settled for undisclosed amounts. My parents got back most of what they'd paid her, plus damages. They used the money to pay down the second mortgage and put some aside for my actual college tuition. The school implemented new policies about private consulting, background checks, and mandatory reporting of concerning behavior. Principal Brennan resigned under pressure. The school board issued public apologies. None of it erased what had happened, but it meant future students had protection we hadn't. That had to count for something. I still think about Mrs. Calloway sometimes, about how completely she'd fooled everyone for so long. She'd understood something fundamental about human nature, how desperate people become when they believe their children's futures are at stake. She'd weaponized that desperation, turning the college admissions process into a predatory business. The scariest part was how normal she'd seemed, how genuinely caring and invested in our success. The manipulation had been invisible until suddenly it wasn't. I'd trusted her completely, and she'd documented my vulnerabilities to use against me later. That kind of betrayal changes how you see authority figures. how you trust institutions, how you evaluate who deserves access to your inner life. Cameron and I talk about it sometimes, late at night when we can't sleep. He's doing better now, slowly figuring out who he is without someone else's script. He's dating someone he actually likes instead of someone who looks good in photos. He's making art that matters to him instead of padding his resume. He's happy in a way he never was at Princeton, and our parents are starting to understand that success doesn't always look the way they imagined. "Do you regret exposing her?" he asked me once. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "No," I finally said, "but I regret that we had to." The stapler I'd been looking for that day stayed in Mrs. Calloway's desk drawer, never retrieved. Sometimes I think about how differently everything could have gone if that drawer hadn't stuck, if I hadn't seen the photos, if I'd just grabbed the stapler and left. 47 students would still be under her control. Hundreds more would have followed in future years. My brother would still be pretending to be someone he wasn't. I'd be at Stanford studying something I didn't care about, performing a version of myself I'd been coached to become. The truth had been expensive and painful, but it had also set us free. 3 years later, I'm a junior at Berkeley studying design and cognitive science, exploring how people think and create. Cameron's work got featured in a gallery show downtown, his graphic novel about a teenager who sells his identity and has to steal it back. We went to the opening together, and our parents actually came too. They've changed, become less focused on prestige and more interested in genuine happiness. It took almost losing everything for them to realize what actually mattered. The experience aged them, but it also opened them up. They ask different questions now, care about different things. We're closer than we've ever been, bonded by surviving something that could have destroyed us. Mrs. Calloway took 5 years from us, but we took back the rest of our lives. I keep the photos of her surveillance pictures on an encrypted drive, archived evidence of how bad things got before we found the courage to fight back. I never look at them anymore, but knowing they exist reminds me that I survived her, and so did everyone else she tried to control. We're still here, still figuring out who we really are, still choosing authenticity over performance. That's the real revenge. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.